Good afternoon, and welcome to our event today, hosted by Defense Priorities. My name is Jennifer Kavanagh. I am the Director of Military Analysis here, and I'm really excited for today's panel. Our topic, the title of our event, is A New War Next Door, the case against U.S. military strikes in Mexico. If you had told most of us probably 10 years ago that we'd be having a panel on the potential that the United States might use military force in Mexico, most people would think that you were crazy. But it is a real debate now. We know from members of President Trump's first administration that this was something that he actively asked for plans for, whether or not it would be possible for the United States to use drone strikes or other types of military activity to destroy drug labs or other types of cartel activities that he felt was a threat to the United States because of smuggling and other types of illicit trafficking across the U.S. border. When he came back to office the second time, this is something that came up again. There have been a number of developments in this area. In February 2025, for example, it was reported that U.S. drone flights were gathering intelligence on cartel operations in Mexico. So it's looming in the background is this question, is what is the Trump administration going to do about the threat from cartels? And is military force an option? And what would that mean? Would it work? Would it not work? That's what we're going to debate today. So a really important and interesting topic. And I am joined by three fantastic panelists. First, my colleague here at Defense Priorities, Dan DePetris, is a fellow at Defense Priorities, where his work focuses on U.S. grand strategy and foreign policy. Dan is also a syndicated foreign affairs columnist at the Chicago Tribune, a foreign affairs writer for Newsweek, and a writer for The Spectator. His recent paper with Defense Priorities, No Jiwa Narco, tackles this issue that we're going to be facing today explicitly, this question of using military force to combat drug cartels in Mexico. Second, Dr. Colin Clark is a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center and also the director of research there. His research focuses on domestic and transnational terrorism, international security and geopolitics, and he has published widely in major news outlets as well as writing several books. His most recent, After the Caliphate, the Islamic State and the Future Terrorist Diaspora, looked at what would happen after the end of U.S. military operations against ISIS. As another fun fact, Colin and I have known each other for a very long time and started working at RAND together when he was still in grad school and I had just finished. So this is a great reunion for us. And last but definitely not least, we have Dr. Aileen Teague. She is an assistant professor in the Department of International Affairs at Texas A&M University's Bush School of Government and Public Service. Her work focuses on U.S. history and relations with Latin America. And she has a forthcoming book, Policing on Drugs, the United States, Mexico, and the Origins of the Modern Drug War from 1969 to 2000. And in this book, she discusses the effect the American drug policy has had on Mexico's politics and security. So a really important angle to think about the questions that we're going to be facing today. So to start off, I'm going to ask a question that I'm hoping we can get thoughts from all three of our panelists on, and then we'll go from there. And so the question that I'm going to ask you all to respond to is military force an effective tool to use against Mexican drug cartels? Why or why not, and to what degree? So I'm going to start in the order that I introduced the panelists with my colleague, Dan.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thanks again for Eileen and Colin for joining us here. I'm very interested in what they have to say on this subject as well. So as for your question, is military force an effective tool to fight Mexican drug cartels? I think to answer this question accurately, we need to kind of remember what the United States is trying to achieve in Mexico over the long term. And from where I sit, it's basically two objectives. It's number one is cutting off or at least reducing the flow of drugs like fentanyl into the United States. And the second is to degrade the power, wealth, and military capacity of the cartels. I would argue that judged by those two metrics, military force hasn't proven effective in the past, and it's probably, I would say, highly unlikely to be effective in the future. We know this because using military force isn't a novel idea. The hypothesis has been tested pretty extensively, particularly in Mexico. Successive Mexican governments have essentially bought into the framework of a war on the cartels and assume that it's not only good policy, but probably the most effective alternative available to pacify the country. When President Felipe Calderon in 2006 won the election, he essentially declared war on the narco trafficking groups, with the assumption that pouring troops in very, very violent areas of the country, establishing checkpoints along key transportation corridors, and killing or capturing senior narco traffickers would squeeze these groups into submission, or perhaps even eliminate them entirely. And as we've seen in the years since, the end result has been precisely the opposite. Cartels have resisted. They've grown far more violent against the Mexican state in general, killing, targeting politicians, police officers, and civilians. And a strategy that was meant to increase the population's confidence in the government in Mexico City has winded up hurting it instead. So essentially, the successive Mexican administrations have bought into the war on our narco traffickers framework, and you could even go into the latest administration, the recently departed administration, with Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, who had a quote unquote hugs not bullets strategy, which in effect was trying to address the root causes of the violence and taking a more bottom-up social aspect of it. But even Obrador kind of relied on the military towards the last 3 years of his presidency. So based on the very brief history that we have over the last 20 years, I'm pretty strong on the point that military force probably makes the situation far more complicated and fragmented against the cartels. It doesn't decrease the violence, and it hasn't done much at all to diminish drug flows into the United States. So we have to ask ourselves, should the United States do something similar? And history suggests the answer is no.
Thanks, Dan. That's a great start. Colin, turning to you. What's your take on this question and on Dan's comments?
So first of all, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about this. I think it's a really important topic and one that's not getting nearly enough attention. I've been very public and open about this, speaking about it, writing about it. Had a piece in the LA Times a while back with Jason Blazakis, who's the former head of the designations office at state, before we even went down this road, basically outlining a few reasons why it makes no sense to declare a violent drug trafficking organization as a foreign terrorist organization. But we're there, and I'm a big believer in dealing with the world that you live in. So I think this webinar is well-timed and completely relevant. Could military force be effective against the cartels? In a perfect world, yes. I guess the question I would ask is, do you trust the current administration to be able to pull that off? And for me, the answer is no. I don't think there's really any administration. It's not even a partisan comment. But I do think that there's been some foreign policy ADD with the Trump administration so far. I guess we've moved on from the Panama Canal, Greenland, bombing Iran, and now it's time to think about Mexico. Highly erratic and really kind of very little continuity through these different adventures. I think, as Dan alluded to, even if it were done correctly, even if we were able to kind of be effective, it does nothing on the other side of the border to address demand in the United States for fentanyl, for all these other drugs. And so, to use a bit of a kind of cliche here, I do think we need a comprehensive approach, but I don't see funding, I don't see policy attention and bandwidth dedicated to that. We're basically cutting funds for everything across the board. We're certainly not going to put more funds into the demand side here in the United States. So again, I think we need to live in the world we are in right now and not in some kind of utopia. I think there's a lot of second and third order effects that we haven't really thought through here. And a few months ago, I was in Doha, Qatar for our Global Security Forum, speaking with longtime counterterrorism analysts about this exact question. In fact, Jennifer, with some of our former RAND colleagues, Brian Jenkins and Ben Conable, really kind of getting into the details about, if the United States did this, what would it look like? Could it be effective? And I think one of the things that I raised, one of the concerns I had, was the reach of some of these cartels. in the United States, right? And could it look like something like a low intensity urban insurgency, right? All the way down to having kind of car bombs going off in major urban areas. I think the reach there has been underestimated. I do think it blurs the lines considerably between counterterrorism and counter narcotics, which presents a whole host of other challenges. And I think, when we talk about this, I've had people say, well, look, it worked in Colombia. Now, we can debate whether it or not it worked in Colombia, putting that aside. But if we start with the premise that it did, I would suggest that Plan Colombia cost billions of dollars and took many, many years before we made progress on that front. Those resources aren't forthcoming. Moreover, we had a very eager and active partner in the Colombians, and the Mexicans may not be nearly as eager nor as capable, at least at this kind of starting point, and are highly protective of their sovereignty, as they should be. So for those of us that have studied building partner capacity and security cooperation, we know that there's a lag effect to these things before they take time. And moreover, you can't just go in there guns blazing against the cartels. There's got to be some kind of mechanism for the quote unquote softer side of this, which means arrests, prosecutions, and the like. Corruption is rampant. And so are you dealing with a partner that actually wants to achieve the same objectives as you do? I have doubts about that. We actually did a project for RAND many, many years ago, and we called the book Mexico is Not Colombia. So if that gives you any sense of how we kind of envisioned some of these questions, we were a bit ahead of the game there. But I'll stop there. I think, again, I just want to make clear, I do think the cartels are a major problem. I do think the country being flooded with fentanyl is a major problem. We haven't addressed the issue of China, where the fentanyl is coming from. But to declare them FTOs and think that we're just going to drone strike our way out of this seems naive and myopic. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. Aileen, over to you.
Absolutely. Jennifer, Dan, and Colin, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be a part of this conversation. I think that you make a very great point, Colin, about addressing demand. And Dan, I think it's very important that we look at the longer history of the use of military force against drug cartels and drug trafficking organizations in Mexico, because history tells us that this has happened many times since the late 1970s, since the inauguration of the war on drugs, in the sense that the United States applies or assists in working with Mexican partners to apply a military force, and it has unintended consequences which have increased violence and instability in Mexico, and in some cases have contributed to the increase in power of some of these drug trafficking organizations. I mean, this started into the 1970s. There were issues in which the United States was directing military aid to the Mexican police and the military during the 80s and during the 90s. And we have seen with the sort of explosion of the drug trade in the 21st century that these measures haven't worked. So I think that history here has shown us that we've tried to do this before. This is not just originating to the Trump one administration or his second administration. This is a problem with much deeper roots. And so no military force is not an effective tool against the cartels, but I will caveat that by saying that we have the ability, and I say we, generally the United States, have the ability to work productively with our Mexican counterparts to increase public security on both sides of the border. And I think that that is an area in which transparent, sort of cooperative military action can be useful to both governments. I want to sort of double down and maybe push back on something that Colin said, in the sense that we have a productive working relationship with the Mexican government. I mean, this is not an antagonistic government to the United States. So, I mean, we have a number of areas in which we've worked productively with them, with the economy, at times with counter narcotics and with counterterrorism. There is a really important link between counterterrorism and counter narcotics. And I do want to draw attention to the fact that regardless of what one's positions or opinions might be about, Mexican border authorities, I mean, they did not let somebody come over and did not cause another terrorist attack after 9/11, and largely have been cooperative partners in counterterrorism in the years after 9/11. So we don't want to sort of undermine and sort of essentialize this sort of question in which we're working with a country that is sort of completely antithetical to our interests, because that is not the case. It's the question of how and with whom. And I think we're all on the same page in that it's not, fair for the United States government under the Trump administration to say that we're going to kind of deploy military troops to Mexico, which is a country that we have had a history of productive relations with. And so I think we need to sort of orient this question around military force as to how we're going to sort of buttress the Mexican government's ability to ensure public security, and how that's going to sort of ensure public security, into the United States. And so President Trump and President Sheinbaum, Mexico's current president, have had some productive dialogue. There's a lot of room for work. I think it's really important, though, to kind of grasp on the various sort of threads of public security and what that means, especially how it's connected to the military. And the Trump administration has had sort of uncomfortably friendly relations with the Nayib Bukele regime in El Salvador, who have started this sort of whole mano dura regime of that we've read about, with people getting locked up, gang members getting locked up in high intensity prisons, and the fact that this has produced some measure or semblance of public safety in El Salvador. And so we want to buttress the Mexican government's efforts at public security, without kind of going too far astray, in the sense that we are, not undermining our partners who practice democracy, and who are trying to establish some semblance, of public safety. So to kind of tie it back all together, in my Cliff's Notes version elevator line response, in the sense that no, military force is not an effective tool against the cartels. I think we really need to dig into, who is employing the military force, through what agencies on both sides of the border, et cetera, and then ask broader questions of how we might use the military, in some cases in a very sort of restrained way, to promote public security on both sides of the border.
Okay, so 3 really great responses that have helped to do a lot to kind of tease out some of the challenging questions surrounding the use of force against cartels. So I want to start by just maybe digging in a little bit to the current status and what's going on for people who are watching this who maybe don't know the ins and outs of what the cartels are involved in, and what each government, Mexico and the United States, are currently doing. So Colin, you mentioned that you wanted to emphasize that, the cartels were a threat, that fentanyl was a threat. So can you dig into that just a little bit and give us sort of like a high level view of like what this threat picture actually looks like? And like, deflated from some of the media hype, in like realistic terms, how the American public should be viewing this threat.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm lucky that one of my academic pursuits was the study of transnational organized crime, and was lucky enough to study under Phil Williams, one of the leading scholars on that topic. So I've been thinking about this, looking at this for a long time. The groups can change over the years. Think back to, at one point, Los Zetas, you have Sinaloa, all these different groups, and they've splintered and morphed. But these are truly transnational criminal organizations. The Mexicans have actually taken up the slack from the Colombians in some manner. With some of the transatlantic trade, we've seen Mexican meth cooks showing up in West Africa, teaching some of the criminals over there and running drugs up into Europe. So the capabilities are immense. The money involved is also immense. And when there's a lot of money involved, you're going to see a lot of resources dedicated to this. You have fentanyl coming in from China, coming into these super labs in Mexico, and they're killing countless numbers of Americans each year. And so I think, to go back to one of the things Aileen said, in terms of, do we have a willing and capable partner? I didn't mean to suggest that the Mexicans weren't willing or capable, but I don't know that they align with the United States vision on this. One, I don't think the United States even knows what the vision looks like here.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, in fairness, right? Of like, and 2, I would go out on a limb and say the Mexicans aren't going to want U.S. drone strikes killing drug traffickers on Mexican soil, particularly if there's significant or even small amounts of collateral damage, right? We've seen this movie before. When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Even under President Obama, we saw drone strikes ramp up, particularly in Pakistan, in the federally administered tribal areas in Waziristan. It becomes a crutch or a cudgel in some ways to deal with any threat that you have. So, my kind of premise is these groups are capable, they're relentless, they're not going to stop, and we need an actual thoughtful, comprehensive strategy with a willing and capable partner, which the Mexicans very well may be, as long as we're on the same page in what the ultimate objective is and what the resources are allocated to achieve that objective. And I don't think we have really any of those pieces in place currently.
So, Eileen, let's talk about what the Mexican government is doing. You referenced this a little bit in your opening comments. What types of specific activities are they involved in right now to try to address some of the cartel issues that President Trump has raised and that they probably, too, are concerned about from a public safety and security perspective, as you mentioned?
Yeah, President Sheinbaum has been able to sort of harness some of that. And I'm not saying there's not work to be done. Let me just be clear on that. We've seen the highly publicized measures that President Sheinbaum has taken, sending 10,000 troops to the border in response to being sort of forced to do so by the whole tariff situation. We've seen some reorganizations of the police taking place inside the federal district itself, and sort of a reconsolidation of the security apparatus, in Mexico. Now, does this have measurable, sort of impactful, outcomes here inside Mexico and at the border? In some ways, it's still too soon to tell. We've seen sort of an erratic policy from the United States, and the Mexican government has been in response mode. If you recall, President Sheinbaum came in office following López Obrador, and it was in a period of time when she had yet to really articulate what her vision was for security and sort of meaningfully moving away from the support and that sort of the policies of her predecessor. So we had been waiting on what her policies had been when a lot of this sort of tariff bullying type stuff formed. And so we're still sort of seeing what the sort of the grander vision is here. The big issues in the bilateral relationship right now are issues of the economy. The U.S. Marine Corps Canada Agreement is going to be renegotiated next year amidst these tariffs. We still have many issues and problems to address with migration. And then the drug trade and security issues, not to mention water and a host of other, issues. And so we're still sort of months, it doesn't feel like it, but we're just months into both the Trump and Sheinbaum administrations. And so it's still sort of to be determined of what it is that the Mexican government could do and what sort of the long-term strategy is. That's why, if you want to kind of look at it optimistically, this is the perfect time for the Trump administration to be more strategic in creating a partnership. And I'm not seeing that happen. And I don't want to just sort of be a broken record of another person sort of critiquing the Trump administration, but this is an opportunity for dialogue. And López Obrador, before Sheinbaum, had pulled out of the Mérida Initiative and sort of the policies that had followed after that. And that was sort of the basis of cooperation before the López Obrador years. And there was a bicentennial framework that was established between the U.S. and Mexican government afterward, and not a lot of energy or oomph has been put into that, agreement. And this is in the midst of all of these other things happening. Personally, and a lot of people have said this, we need to have some sort of, especially with renegotiating our economic relationship and openness, and believe it or not, we need to be having the conversations about our economic relations alongside the conversations about our illicit economic relations, sort of at the same time, because they affect each other. And so I think that we need to have some sort of larger security agreement that's taking place with the renegotiation, hopefully, of USMCA in 2026.
Right. So let's turn to you, Dan. What can we say about the U.S. side? What was the Biden administration's stance on this? What were they doing for the past 4 years? And what do we know so far about how Trump is thinking about the use of military force?
Yeah, so I mean, as far as I can tell, the Biden administration really did want to work through the Mexican government. They viewed a viable, realistic, comprehensive relationship with Mexico as really the first line of defense to tackle this issue. And I think ultimately that's correct. You need a willing, as we been talking about the last 10, 15 minutes, you need a willing partner who is both capable and has a political will to cooperate with Washington on an issue that arguably is a mutual interest of ours. Biden did attempt to address the demand side of things as well. And I think, Colin made a good point is we tend to talk about the supply side of the equation way too much and kind of neglect the demand side. But in any way, I would argue that the demand side is, if not just as popular, just as popular as or significant as the supply side, if not more significant. If you have a large demand across the United States, the cartels and the people who are selling these products are going to have a financial incentive to continue their operations. It's really as simple as that. The military force can't address that. So the Biden administration did take some positive steps with the Mexicans. I think the Trump administration, we use the word erratic, and I think that's a perfect description of what's happening right now. They don't really look at the Mexican government as a partner. They view it as sort of a hindrance and an obstacle to, or a scapegoat even to the overdose epidemic. What's that?
Or subordinate.
Or subordinate. Precisely. And so, I think the administration's discussions about, should we use drone strikes or military force against the cartels of Mexico? It's partly motivated by frustration, and I think it's partly motivated by this naive assumption that we can just bomb the cartels into submission and they would give up a lifeline that has generated billions upon billions of dollars for them. So that's where we are. And it's to say it's discouraging would be a charitable term to use, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. So this gives us a good sense, I think, of the lay of the land. So in February, President Trump formally designated a number of Latin American crime organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. And a couple of you mentioned this in your remarks. So I want to dig into the consequences of this a little bit, because I think it's a little bit fuzzy and unclear to a lot of us. Sort of like, what is the significance of this? What are the consequences? Like, does this give him additional authorities? And why didn't Biden or a previous president take this action?
I'll just weigh in on this briefly because I've been, out in the open talking about it. I think to start with at a conceptual level, if everything is terrorism, then nothing's terrorism, right? If every ill that, impacts our country is terrorism, it kind of loses meaning. It's diluted. It's, watered down. There's also some real tangible impacts here, right? So let's say, look, now MS-13, Tren de Aragua, Sinaloa cartels, these are now foreign terrorist organizations by law. So what happens to the material support clause? Does that mean that some 17-year-old kid in Philadelphia who's doing hand-to-hands on a street corner, and gets arrested is now supporting a foreign terrorist organization? We don't need more people in prison. We probably need less. We have a prison industrial complex in this country. And I think it also speaks to one of the things that we constantly get wrong. And I'll go back and stand on my soapbox for a minute. I've never liked the name the Global War on Terrorism for a number of reasons, but one, it never made sense to me to declare war on a tactic, right? We didn't declare war on blitzkrieg. Why? Because it would make no sense. But we often use these kind of analogies or metaphors, and I think our political leadership underestimates the intelligence of the American public. We love to declare war on things, right? The war on poverty, the war on crime, the war on drugs, which I think drugs won. The war on gluten or whatever's coming next. I support that one, by the way. But it really just kind of muddies the water, and it really kind of leads people to, it's supposed to have a rallying effect, but it dumbs down the concept of exactly what we're doing. Just two other comments. One thing I wanted to really kind of foot stomp that Aileen said. She said we're just months into the Trump administration, although it doesn't feel like it. And I completely agree with that. It feels a lot longer, and I think about that every day. And I'm also not somebody who just wants to come on here and bash the Trump administration. I'm an equal opportunity hater across the board. I'm critical of, I'm not a partisan person. But I do think that the current administration is not strategic, which you alluded to. And I think a lot of our partners aren't strategic either. If you look at what's happened since October 7th, the Israelis aren't necessarily strategic. And I think sometimes emerging technologies and drones and all the kind of whiz-bang stuff we have, it obviates the need for strategy. It's kind of like a sugar rush, and it emphasizes tactics. But what happens down the line, right? We're going in, we're breaking a lot of stuff. We're saying, cool, look what we did. And then when you kind of sit back, the problem's not solved. It's really kind of kicking the can down the road. So I'm somebody that's constantly argued for a more strategic, more thoughtful, more patient approach. But when you go before Congress, which I don't even know if we do anymore, but let's say that we still do that, and you say, hey, look, we have a really big problem. It's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to take a long time, and the results, positive results, aren't guaranteed. You'll be kicked out of the door quicker than you walked in. And I think we've lost that in many ways, the ability to be patient, to conduct that kind of long-term planning, right? That's a relic of the Cold War. It's certainly not something for the kind of current zeitgeist. Sorry, I'll step back down off my soapbox now.
No, I mean, I think it's a really important point, the point about drone strikes. We've seen President Trump really cling on to this tactic, even in his first administration, of the kind of like big strikes, then go home. And you kind of accomplish a tactical win that looks spectacular. You don't actually accomplish anything strategic. And some people have started referring to that as like the Trump doctrine, which I think is a sort of a big mistake, because that tactic has very few situations where that tactic achieves anything at all. And I think this, as we're kind of coming to the conclusion here, the question of cartels is not a go big and then come home and you're done. It's a long-term problem. So, but I am interested in getting Eileen's and Dan's thoughts on this designation question, whether or not there are any advantages to doing this, whether it gives legal authorities or opens doors that were previously closed that could be helpful.
Yeah, I'll just chime in real quick. And maybe this is tying together ideas from Dan's previous comments about, the political utility of particularly the Republican Party in the United States using military force against Mexico as this sort of litmus test. There was a great article in The Atlantic about that about a year and a half ago, and how politically, useful that is. And I think that idea ties very well to this foreign terrorist organization, designation for, a handful of groups, some of which many Americans had never heard of. I mean, Tren de Aragua really hadn't been coming up in the news too much, and most Americans probably learned about the group probably within the last year. And so I think that the question here is, and maybe this touches on what Colin's comments told us, is this, question of the foreign terrorist organization designation was part of this sort of grand utility of border security issues, of the migration strategy under the Trump administration, which we've seen kind of go awry in a host of different ways with the loss of personal freedom. And it's just sort of part of this, broader strategy that the Trump administration is, trying to take, that seems politically useful and seems to speak to, his base of people that don't really know that much about the border. Really, they don't have a lot of direct experience with the border, and yet from Ohio or, from other sort of Republican strongholds, I mean, you see these news images of sort of migrants sort of getting, going to open borders, which, seems to be the sort of powerful image that rallies the base. And I mean, we don't have more of a complex, nuanced understanding of, why this is happening and, why it's, occurring. And the foreign terrorist organization really kind of comes in as this sort of useful measure that is politically useful, in showing that the administration is, doing something, even though sort of the long-term fix to some of these migration issues elude us. And then the final thing I'll say here is that another reason why the foreign terrorist organization is not very powerful is because The U.S. sort of policy response historically to Latin America more broadly and Mexico in particular is that you kind of give it a lot of attention and it comes up in the news, periodically, and it's front page news, and then it's on the back burner for 5 months, and then it comes back again. And I think that this foreign terrorist organization is very much, it was at the forefront of the news, but we really haven't been talking about it, that much again. And I'm wondering what sort of incident is going to come up in the next couple of months that puts it again to the forefront. But we really haven't done anything, with the designation except use it for, some sense of political utility.
Mm-hmm. Dan, what do you think, and how do you think that the militarization more generally of the border fits in here? Because we've seen the Trump administration try to, number one, deploy, I think there's now about 10,000 active duty forces along the southern border, and also create attachments to military bases along the border that are federal military owned property, so they can use this to arrest migrants as they cross the border. So how do you see a connection here between the effort to make these groups foreign terrorist organizations and this push to militarize border enforcement? Are these related or not?
Yeah, I think Eileen hit the nail on the head. This is really a political symbolic statement on the part of the administration more than an actual policy that's concrete and would mitigate the problem that we're trying to mitigate, which is in this instance is stopping or at least severely reducing fentanyl inflows into the United States. You don't need to put 60,000, 80,000 U.S. troops along the southern border to detect fentanyl. And for the most part, for the vast majority of fentanyl that comes into the United States is basically carried by American citizens or people who have dual passports that go through legal ports of entry. So this whole notion that we should spend, tens of billions of dollars on a deployment of U.S. troops at the border and pretend that it's actually going to do anything to dent the flow of drugs is just nonsensical and, quite frankly, comical because it's so outlandish. What you need at the border is more authority to essentially depict or pick up fentanyl testing equipment. You need testing equipment. You need an actual concentration, bureaucratic wise, of what you want to do. And as we talk, the administration doesn't seem to have a bureaucratic strategy or a strategy of any kind. It's almost throwing spaghetti up against the wall and seeing what sticks. So yeah, whether it's FTO designations, whether it's padding the border with troops, it's more I think a reflection of where he is of appetizing the base of his party than it is a concrete solution to solve anything or mitigate anything.
All right, so I want to come back to solutions in just a minute, but I want to just for a moment talk just a little bit more in depth about what this drone plan would be. We talk sort of in broad terms about using military force against cartels, but can each of you maybe talk a little bit about how you see what would this operation look like? Are we talking post 9/11 style Reaper drones going in? Are we talking smaller drones taking out drug labs? Are we talking ground troops? What types of things have you heard proposed, just to give us a better sense of what this military activity would look like if something happened that triggered, brought it back to the front page, as Eileen said, and pushed a decision in that direction?
I'll jump in real quickly because I think the initial reports, and I remember seeing them on CNN, were that we were just conducting ISR, right? So intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, trying to get a picture of what was going on where. I don't know that we would actually use armed drones to strike cartel members. Maybe we would, but certainly going after the labs, and one would presume that people are in those labs, right? Cooking the drugs and mixing them, manufacturing them. But I do want to go back briefly because this ties in to something that was said earlier, and that was what type of incident could move this conversation back onto the front page. I think Eileen mentioned it, and this happens often, right, where we have this kind of this lack of attention to a story, and then a major incident happens, and all of a sudden there's this political pressure that builds. And this also goes back to something Aileen said, to do something. It reminds me of what Jennifer, our former colleague at RAND, Ali Wine, used to call the do something doctrine, right? If you're doing something, right, that's better than doing nothing, which doing something can be counterproductive if you haven't thought it through. So envision this scenario where some U.S. citizens are in Mexico and they're kidnapped or killed, and this has happened already, right, on a couple of occasions, where there's some gruesome beheading video that gets released, right? And this is not to minimize the loss of life in any way, but that kind of image, and we've seen this, the power of images before with the Islamic State, could really lead to some political pressure on the Trump administration to do something. Okay, to do what? Let's show that we're not impotent. Let's show that we're forceful. Let's show that we're striking back. And that in turn could lead to a slippery slope, right? Where we start doing things and, the president gets a pat on his back and the administration gets kudos, saying like, you're actually doing things that no one's done before. But then we find ourselves in this quagmire that we don't know how to extricate ourselves from, where we're in a no kidding knockdown, drag out war against these very amorphous kind of drug cartels, while we're also trying to balance support for Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East, all of these other issues that we have on our plate. It just seems to me, in for a penny, in for a pound, right? How do you kind of do this and not get kind of dragged into this? And again, if the objectives aren't clear, we could find ourselves with some kind of mission creep or slippery slope where we go down this road with no end in sight. And that's one of my main concerns.
Yeah, I mean, real quick on this question, as far as reports I've read, U.S. drones are already used for surveillance activities, and the Mexican government has commented on the fact that the use of drones is cooperative and sort of conducted, in agreement between the two governments. I think the question that maybe we're debating with here is, what happens if sort of drone use becomes more unilateral? I think there's questions now in which drones and other sort of weaponry are used for counter drone activity because cartels use drones. I mean, and so you have to kind of have tools for counter drone activities, and that is also I've also read reports that is used. I mean, so I think that more of the question here is what happens, and I mean this has increasingly come up if this use of drones in Mexico or U.S. drones is unilateral. And obviously, I think that is probably not a wise choice. And I think I would echo with what Colin was saying is that it kind of opens up the landscape for there to be sort of a lot of murkiness in terms of what the rules are for the usage of these drones. But I think that for the moment, the use of drones in a cooperative sense, especially for surveillance that have led to arrests of criminals, is not necessarily a bad thing.
If I just can pick up very briefly on something that Aileen said about if drone use becomes unilateral, right? Because we've seen these situations before where the U.S. acts unilaterally, and there's two options, right? There's what we've seen some countries do where they say, yeah, we're for this, right? Well, we co-sign this because they don't want to seem that they're completely helpless, and that's a bad, being weak to your own domestic population, not a good look. Then there's the inverse of that, where we have the wink, wink, nod, nod with the country, and they come out to their public and say, we condemn this fully, right? They don't want to co-sign this. So either way, it's not a good situation and it's not transparent.
Yeah, Jennifer, I just want to, going beyond the tactical issue of the drones, let's focus on the Mexican domestic politics of the reaction. What would occur in the event that the United States used unilateral drone strikes on Mexican territory? This is sort of an anecdote. I think it's interesting. So my wife is from Mexico originally, right? Her father's side is very devoted pre-followers. They did not like Obrador at all. My mom's side are Obrador lovers. They couldn't be further away from the political spectrum in Mexico. The one thing that they agree on is they don't want any unilateral U.S. military force inside Mexico. So this is actually one of the issues in Mexican politics, which is almost as divisive as American politics. Not as divisive, but almost. This is the one issue that actually kind of creates a rally around the flag effect in Mexico and would probably spark the kind of anti-Americanism inside Mexico that we're already seeing this year for a variety of other things, whether it's economic policy or just cost of living issues, because Americans are moving down to Mexico frequently and everything like that. So this is an issue even going beyond whether it will work tactically, which I think I would argue it wouldn't. It would be a Band-Aid on a kind of like a gaping wound. Politically, is it smart? And judging by Mexican politics and where it stands today, I would argue it's beyond counterproductive, and it could be even be dangerous to the bilateral relationship, going beyond counter narcotics.
All right, so I think we've talked a lot now about like what not to do and like solutions that aren't working or that haven't worked. So let's shift gears a little bit and think in our last 15 minutes or so about what would work. Like what would be a set of, hopefully non-military policies that would help to make progress. I don't think any of us think that in the next 4 years, this problem is going to be solved. The problem of cartel violence or fentanyl is going to be solved. But what are some like proactive things that, governments on each side could do? And Eileen, maybe I'll start with you because I think you had a sort of compelling a piece in your opening remarks here about like the need to focus on, public security, and that this was something that both sides could work constructively towards. So maybe I'll ask you to start and just build a little bit off this and what you see that would translate into specifically in the policy domain on each side of the border.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tease out some ideas, but I feel like I've benefited a lot from going third on most of these questions. But I think first is definitely opening up negotiations, equal negotiations, equal partnership between both countries on security issues. And I think that the renegotiation of USMCA is coming up next year is a really important opportunity to do that. I think that aid between U.S. aid to Mexico can help in terms of sort of making sure that we're helping to reinforce sort of legal institutions and not just sort of blindly giving aid and not knowing sort of where it's going and how it's being used. And I think that above all, diplomatically, not forcing Mexico's hand, treating them, like a partner. These are both countries are each other's most important trading partner. I think that there is lots of room for cooperation. I think that not everybody in the Mexican government is tied to corruption in some way or form, and we want to treat them, as such. So I think that opening up dialogue we had the Merida Initiative, we had in 2023 the Bicentennial Framework that opened up dialogue, and that's just sort of been on the back burner for 2 years. I think that we need to open up a more explicit dialogue on security issues. There's a lot of really smart people, policymakers with deep relations on both sides of the border that are still around and could be involved. And so I think that kind of bringing that kind of discourse to the forefront and not, questions of forcing hands via tariffs or deploying military troops to Mexico would be a really good first start.
Great. Colin or Dan, do you want to build off that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just briefly mention what I think earlier would get me kicked right back out of Congress, if I was testifying before, which is to say this is going to take a long time. It's going to cost a lot of money, and it's not guaranteed to work. Building institutional capacity, working with prosecutors, when someone's arrested, are they able to be held, right? And they're not walking right out the back door. Counter-corruption initiatives, all the things that I usually rail against where I say, and again, you can appreciate this because you worked at RAND for a long time. We'd spend years working on research reports, 200-300 pages, and then the policy recommendations would be bullets like counter-corruption, strengthen the rule of law. And I'm like, yeah, no shit. How do you actually do that? It's a lot easier said than done, right? So, one concrete measure is looking at best practices and lessons learned from places where it's worked. So Italy is a good example. The Carbonieri and some of the things that were done against Sicilian mafia, bring the Italians over and trying to figure out what they did that was successful. Now, they still have the 'Ndrangheta, the Camorra, all these different groups, but for a long time they smashed the Sicilian mafia, and they did that in a legal way that adhered to the rule of law. So talking to others that have grappled with this, just very, very briefly, and lastly, we haven't really mentioned the elephant or maybe the dragon in the room. That's China. So, that's the source of a lot of the precursor chemicals of the fentanyl that's coming over. As part of negotiations, and we're in a kind of, on again, off again trade war. There's a bargain to be had there, because it's the same thing when we talk about like rogue groups operating from Russian soil. I'd say the same thing with criminal organizations in China. No one operates in that country without the tacit approval of the government. I just don't. I refuse to believe it. Now, maybe at the local level, but the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is allowing this to happen. Why are they allowing it to happen? Well, it keeps us busy chasing our tail. It kills a lot of American citizens. It's a massive headache for us, and so that behooves them. If there's something that the Chinese would actually agree to, some kind of quid pro quo where they would actually, clamp down on this, and I don't know what that looks like. I haven't thought enough about it, but there's got to be more that the Chinese can do, that they're capable of doing, that could help at least stem the flow to Mexico. So I think that's something we should consider on the table.
Yeah, before we move on, I want to ask you a quick follow-up, which is, all right, so you go into Congress and you tell them this is going to be long, expensive, and I can't promise you it's going to work. Do you have any thoughts? And it's fine for you to say no, because it's a tough question, but on like, how do you build a constituency for activities like that? Like, because that seems to be a requirement here. Like, you have to eventually have enough like stakeholders that believe that it's worth the long-term commitment to convince Congress or whoever's providing the money. So do you have any thoughts on like first steps towards building that type of coalition?
Maybe doing it with like a coloring book and crayons to explain it in a way that people can understand it. No, I mean, joking aside, I think there's probably people in Congress that have lost loved ones, including family members, to this scourge. So starting with people that care. There's folks, he's no longer in Congress, but somebody like Mike Gallagher, who was, a quote unquote China hawk, who's a Republican that worked across the aisle. First time I ever testified before Congress, he was somebody that came in the room, met all the witnesses, was very smart about policy, and I didn't consider a partisan person. There's got to be more people like that actually do care about what's happening to American citizens, that want to be thoughtful in the way that we approach this, and in the process don't want to get us dragged into some kind of unending, war across the border with one of our neighbors that's seemingly unwinnable. I'm a New Yorker, so I'm ultimately a pessimist at heart, but I do believe that there's got to be people that we can reach out to, that we can bring together on both sides of the aisle that care enough about this.
Eileen, did you have a two-finger?
Yeah, quick two-finger, response. I, wholeheartedly agree with you, Colin, and I think I would add to that in saying that, the response here for issues of migration and drugs, these kind of two things dovetail together. I think there's a lot of opportunities for the response to be regional. Panama is dealing with issues with migration. Costa Rica, we have these sort of, fairly developed partners that we could be working with in terms of creating more of a regional security solution. And, some of these partners are dealing with upsurges in crime without much support from the United States. And all of this is transnational. It's not just we can't just sort of contain it to Mexico. And so I think that Vice President Biden and then the President Biden, they tried to sort of inaugurate a root causes strategy. I think that we could have a lot more PR and a lot more sort of visibility on how some of these things could be more of a regional cooperative type agreement, and that we might kind of expand that into more of less militarized or more shared type of agreement that we can kind of do hemispherically. But the United States has not been really good about historically promoting these hemispheric relations in a way that could benefit it. From Canada, on down, especially now. So I think that there's a lot of room for making this more of a cooperative type responsibility. And I think the second two-finger kind of tap about China is we have to be operating from the point that I mean, we're not really seeing a lot of fentanyl coming from China to Mexico. I mean, the Chinese taught the Mexican cartels how to make it, so there's not a flow anymore. And we kind of have to be operating from the point in which there's really not that much of a flow. And I'm not sure how much pressure really could put on China, because yes, I absolutely agree with you, Colin, that all of this happened with probably the at least the sort of the tacit sort of approval of the Chinese government. But we kind of have to, our starting point really needs to be that the Mexican drug trafficking organizations are already they already have cracked the code on this, and they're operating, they're not operating as a junior partner to China. And in fact, there's been a lot of recent reports in which they're trying to actually expand their operations, these Mexican DTOs, to areas near China, and how that could really pose difficulties for China. And so I don't disagree that China needs to be sort of dealt with here, but I'm not sure, how much pushing China and working with China is going to kind of work towards, dismantling or disempowering these powerful drug cartels in Mexico.
All right, great points. Dan, over to you for your thoughts on constructive solutions.
Yeah, so I think the United States has a really bad habit of expecting a lot from Mexico, but not kind of expecting the same amount for itself. So we tend to dictate to the Mexicans about what they need to do. And then when the Mexicans have, concerns about issues such as arms trafficking across the U.S.-Mexico border, we either sweep it under the rug or do some token kind of counter narcotics or counter trafficking measures. The fact is, I think the latest statistics I saw was about 75% of illegal traceable firearms in Mexico are originally come from the United States. That's a huge problem. If we want the Mexican army and the Mexican state to judge this adequately, manage this problem adequately, they can't be overpowered by cartel firepower. It's just completely counterproductive and to what we want to do. So I would say it's an obvious recommendation, but I think it's very important. We need to get serious about cracking down on straw buyers in states like Texas, Georgia, Florida, the southern states where most of these firearms originate from. And if we do that, we're not going to decrease the power of the cartels. We're not going to eliminate them, but we can at least reduce their capacity to inflict violence and to challenge the Mexican government. I mean, that's a very common sense policy measure that Colin will probably also get me kicked out of testifying in Congress. So we'd be buddies.
All right, so we are just about out of time. So I guess I will ask each of the panelists if they have maybe like a 1 minute final thoughts, and then I'll wrap it up. So I guess maybe we'll go in the reverse order that we did to start with. So I'll start with Eileen, then go to Colin, and then finish with Dan.
I actually, Jennifer, want to cede my time to my colleagues here. I don't really have too much to say, except for the fact that I think it's really important to kind of look at the broader history of this issue, especially how much it originates decades before the Trump administration. And this has been a fantastic talk on a really important topic.
Great, thanks. Okay, Colin.
Just briefly, I'd say put your money where your mouth is. I don't think that's likely with all the Doge cuts. We're cleaning house. We're kind of hollowing out capabilities, and you can't have your cake and eat it too. So you can't reduce all of this capability and all this bureaucracy with one fell swoop and then think we're going to accomplish really difficult tasks. So figure out what's worth pursuing, put money behind it, put personnel behind it, come up with an actual strategy and implement it. I know that sounds fanciful for people in Washington, but that would be, if I was king for a day, what I'd do with my magic wand.
And Dan.
So I think, the United States doesn't have a silver bullet to solve this problem. I don't think the problem is solvable. I think you can manage it, but I don't think you can ultimately solve it. The best thing the United States can do in the end is not do stupid shit. That's the Obama phrase. Don't do stupid stuff. Do not unilaterally use force in Mexico, particularly when the Mexican government is opposed to that concept, and it would probably, do nothing whatsoever to decrease the power of the cartels. It would probably fracture them still further. And as we see in history over the last 2 decades, The number of armed groups in Mexico has risen considerably. The rate of violence has increased considerably, and the drugs haven't slowed one iota. So, this is just basically a flashy object that responsible policymakers should put in the closet for not even a rainy day.
Well, I think that's, a really great and important point to end on. I think we covered a lot of ground here. It's a really complex topic. I think, though, the answer here is clear that we cannot bomb our way out of this problem. It is a problem that requires a long-term and comprehensive solution, as Colin said, a bilateral solution that involves building coalitions on both sides of the border, as well as dialogue and cooperation across the border between the two sides. I really like the idea of framing this as sort of like a public safety or public security question, and really thinking about like where are the levers or the entry points where we can make a difference to manage this problem. Is it the demand side? Is it the supply side? Is it located in Mexico? Is it coming from somewhere else? I think those are key questions for policymakers. But I think the number one takeaway here is that this is going to be a challenge that's with us for a long time. So we should be thinking about long-term solutions and recognize that it's going to require a significant investment of time and resources to turn the ship around, given the challenges that we face. So with that, we will wrap up for today. Thanks everybody for joining. Thank you to my wonderful panelists, Eileen, Colin, and Dan, for their time and expertise today. And we hope that you will join us again for another Defense Priorities live stream in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you.